I've been using the Loki Zero for the better portion of the last week as my main handheld, and I gotta say, I still absolutely love this device. While spending the last week getting some indie gaming done on this device, I've also been really enjoying Sea of Stars. But since I've been spending some time on this, and since this is my main handheld for the last week, I've also been doing a lot of tweaks on here to try to get the best performance possible out of it. Today I'm going to show you a couple different tricks here to get the absolute best performance possible out of the Loki Zero. Today though, I wanted to do something a little special with this handheld. We're going to be turning the Loki Zero into the Loki Zero Ultra by doing a couple extra tweaks to this device. Every aspect of performance, we're going to be pushing this thing to its absolute limits. We're going to be upgrading the RAM from 8 gigs to 12, and in that regard, we're also going to be able to get 2 gigs of VRAM while still maintaining 10 gigs of RAM in Windows. I got something special planned for these joysticks, and I'm interested to see what you guys think about it. We're going to try those as well, and we're also going to upgrade the storage. I could have done something a little bit more excessive with the storage, but since this is going to be mostly focused on indie gaming and lighter AAAs, I definitely wanted to have some limitations here. For the SSD, I've gone with this Micron one here that I pulled out of my ROG Ally. I did have this in my Steam Deck, but I downgraded my Steam Deck to 256 since I was using my ROG Ally more. I figure 512 gigs of storage should be way more than enough for the emulation titles and the indie titles that we're going to be playing on the Loki Zero. However, if you want to upgrade your other Loki devices with a bigger hard drive, go for it. I figure 512 should be way more than enough for my purposes. For the memory upgrade, I chose to go with an 8 gig stick of crucial memory. This is spec'd at 3200 MHz at 1.2 volts CL22. That's pretty decent latency for 3200 MHz, and I figure this should be a pretty decent chip for the device itself. There's a community member that has been doing some testing on the RAM itself, and he figured out that the internal one that's already soldered to the board is spec'd at 3200 MHz. The RAM looks like it becomes desynced if you use anything different than 3200 MHz, I believe, so I'm going to try using this, and we're going to see if I can get it in sync. You do lose a couple FPS if they're not in sync. However, if you do want to match the onboard memory, you do want to have that 3200 MHz. You can use a 4 gig chip if you only bought the 4 gig model, but I'm going to go for the 8 gig one here. I was tempted to grab a 16, but I figured 16 was a little overkill for the CPU, and I figure 8 is a good balance. Using an 8 gig stick of memory here is also going to let me use 2 gigs of VRAM. I have been VRAM limited in a few games at 1 gig, but for the most part, 1 gig is the solid gold medium here that you want to aim for. 2 gigs though should definitely give you some overhead, and I think that's kind of what I'm going to be aiming for here. And since this is 3200, it should also match the memory that's soldered on the board. This 8 gig stick actually came out of my Minisform UM690. Let's give this a try in this PC and see how it goes. Before you do any upgrades on a device like this, you want to make sure that it's completely powered off. In case you're wondering how that plastic has been holding up on the back, it's been holding up pretty good. It's actually pretty decent for anti-fingerprint still, and I'm not noticing much. There's a couple there, but for the most part, it doesn't look too bad. To get the backplate off, we're going to need a small Phillips screwdriver. I'm actually kind of concerned that I don't have a screwdriver with a head this small, so I'm going to see if I have one of these, and I'll be right back. There's 4 screws on the back here though, so we're going to need to get these off before we open the unit. In case you're wondering about the screwdriver size, this one fits perfect, so this is the one I'm going to be using for the teardown. Let's go ahead and take those 4 screws out now. When you've got those screws out, make sure to take out your micro SD card. Now that we have those out and the 4 screws out, we're ready to take off the back plate. Let's try getting this open. I'm going to stick the pry tool here along this seam, and we're going to try to pop it open. So what I found worked best was actually just sticking my fingernail in the seam here and then going down along the locks. Just stick it in here at the start, and then you can use the pry tool to go along the edge. Just work your way around the edge with that. The side might be a little bit more difficult, but we should be able to get that open too. Yeah, that's not bad. I thought that was going to be harder. I gotta admit though, this device has been pretty easy to open so far, and it's just sliding it down here. It is popping them open pretty easy. Let's continue and get the rest open. Rest of the other side is pretty easy to get off as well, and then the back plate just lifts off. Make sure all the screws are out before you lift off the back plate. Unfortunately, I didn't have it filming when I pulled it off, but all you had to do was just go around that last side and just lift it straight up, and it came off really easy. And now we're inside the Loki. This is really well built. I love how they position the PCB, the cooling. It's really well designed. You can see the SSD there. We're going to have to get that out. To do that, we're going to have to lift off this fan, and that's not too hard either. I'm going to use my ceramic tip tweezers to get this little sticker off. To remove the fan, you're going to want a slightly bigger Phillips. At this point, I would probably recommend disconnecting the battery. However, since it's under the board here, it's kind of hard to get out. We should be fine though, however, as we are only removing the SSD and we're not touching any of the electronics here. To get the fan out, all we have to do is to remove these two screws and it should come up pretty easy. Let's go ahead and do that now. Now all we have to do is to peel this up a little bit so we can lift this fan out of the way. You can use those tweezers again to do that. If you take a little bit closer look at it, you can kind of see how it looks. The heatsink in this thing is absolutely massive. This is kind of hard to see, but on the Loki Zero, there's a small latch. The latch is right here. And that's what's holding the fan in. So once you got these two screws out, just pinch on each side of these locks and it should come up pretty easy. And there you go. Just be extremely careful when you're lifting this, as there's still a plug in the board down here and you don't want to remove that. We got to go back to our small screwdriver to get the rest of the shielding out. There's a few small fan headers and power connections that we need to remove. This one and this one. They run on this little plastic piece here, and that's blocking the memory from coming out. All I did was unplug these, then just pull the one that was on top up first and just drag it down through this little crevice here. Then I got the other one out, and now we should be good to pull this plastic piece off. We might actually have to get the SSD out first, so let's take this out next. My model had a Bywin AP445 PCIe M2 drive. Never heard of it before, but it's been pretty decent so far. If you look closely though, yeah, that was holding down the board because this is gonna pop right out now. And there you go. Now we can swap the RAM. These two locks on the sides just have to push out for it to get unlocked. Then the stick should come right out. The stick of RAM I had was MMY2666 with a CL19 latency. Never heard of this either. I had an 8 gig model, so there was 4 on the board and 4 here. If you saw the way I pulled that out, the notch is up here at the top, so you want to make sure that the notch is further down as you put it in. If you look directly under the heatsink, you'll be able to see that notch. Slot that into place, then push it down until it locks. Well, what made it a heck of a lot easier was making sure that it was pushed in on both sides. When it was pushed down on both sides, it went down pretty easy. But I checked it and it looks fine, and it also doesn't seem to be damaged by being close to this. Now that we got that in there, let's put the case back on. Plastic shielding can go on next. Now let's just put those screws back in. Then we just put the M2 drive back in. Make sure the notch lines up when you're putting these in. There you go. When you're sticking these in, just make sure that you're following which ones you're putting in. This one here that connects to the speaker, you want to make sure that that one goes into the speaker one. There is some text here telling you which one is which. In case you're curious though, the bottom one here is for the speaker. And the top one here is for the rumble. Those are pretty easy to push in just with your fingers. I would also recommend putting them in that order as well, because the bottom one here is the one that goes underneath in this little crevice. Then the top one is a little longer and it can go on top, going into that one there. The fan should just snap down into place onto these clips. Use the top part here first, then lever it down into the bottom. It'll clip onto these two clips here. Once you push that tape down, all you have to do is put these two screws in. If the screws aren't going in, make sure to look down straight over top of the hole here so you can see if the screw hole underneath lines up. Let's get those two screws back in. That was a little finicky, but not too bad. And there's one more thing that I want to swap out, and that's these joysticks. These joysticks are pretty good, but the caps also match the frame. I kind of wanted to accent it a little bit, so I got these. These are caps from the King Kong Pro 2 controller, and they should work absolutely flawlessly in this device. I'm going to swap out the black ones for these silver ones here, and I think this is going to look really sharp. Thankfully, these joysticks are a little bit easier to get into. We just have the one ribbon cable at the top and the 3 screws. Let's take out this ribbon cable and these screws and swap that cap. Here's a close-up of the controller boards and the cap itself. This cap, to remove it, it's pretty easy. All we have to do is just pull it straight off. And there you go. These are not Hall sensors, unfortunately, but they're still pretty decent joysticks. Let's get that silver one on there. This is what the caps look like on the back. They're a little different, but for the most part, I think this one should work with no issues. This one is also slightly smaller, but I think it should be okay. Okay, you guys gotta admit, this looks pretty awesome. I think that looks amazing. And they're really smooth too. There's a little bit of opening, but I don't think that's going to be an issue because people mention that you can use Xbox caps on the King Kong Pro 2 controllers. You should be able to use them on here. All we have to do now is to do the other side. There's still 3 screws on this side and the 1 ribbon cable, so let's pull that out and swap the cap. I got the other 2 originals here, and I'll keep these as a backup just in case I want to use them again. Just give a once over quick to make sure everything is plugged in before you close the back. Then all we have to do is just put the back on and put those 4 screws back in. To get the back on, what I generally like to do is use the hinge method. So start at the top, get those clips in, then hinge it down to the bottom. Let's go ahead and do that now. This part here on mine wasn't completely closed, so I just had to push that shut. The edges look okay, and the bottom was fine as well. Let's get those 4 screws in and start it up. After swapping it all I had to do was just clone my old OS. Now that we've cloned the old OS, you can see, yeah, this thing looks awesome. These silver joysticks look amazing. I've also previously unlocked this BIOS thanks to the BIOS that AYN has shared on their Discord channel. If you haven't done so yet, make sure to check their official Discord and look in the Loki Zero chat. It should be pinned in the comments. Let's power this thing on and I'll show you what's going on with it in Windows. After cloning the drive, the OS is the same as I left it. So the only difference now is we have that extra hard drive space. I've gone from a 128 to a 512. And yeah, I got lots of space now. This drive is also a lot quicker than the other ones, so I shouldn't have any issues. As far as the RAM upgrade, well, there's a little story behind that. The RAM upgrade went successfully, and we now have 11 gigs of RAM. I have 4 gigs on board and that 8 gig memory stick. That brings our total to 12 gigs of RAM. However, I am using 1 gig currently for my VRAM. I'm going to be upping this to 2 gigs as I definitely don't need 11 gigs of RAM in Windows, and I think the extra gig would do really some wonders for the VRAM on this device. I've also gone ahead and set the memory speed to 3200 megahertz. Someone on the official Discord figured something out that was a little interesting. So the onboard 4GB memory on the Loki Zero is clocked in at 3200 megahertz. And if you remember, the one that we pulled out was 2666. This causes some issues. Now, because the memory was clocked down on both, it still was fine, but if you look in the CPU-Z under the memory page here, you can see now that the clocks are asynchronous. Before, they were out of sync. This would cause a little bit of FPS dips. That's because I've gone ahead and changed that frequency of the RAM system-wide to 3200 megahertz. We're also getting CL20 latency, which is pretty decent. And the command rate of 1 is excellent. Think of a command rate as how often the car has to go around a racetrack to get the 1 lap. There's either 1 timing or 2. If you have 1, well, the car only has to go around the racetrack once. At the top corner here, it also shows us that we are still running in dual channel. The only thing is now it is in sync and we are currently matching the memory frequency of the RAM on the motherboard. It won't show us the specs of the motherboard RAM, but someone was able to pull that off using some extra tools. The memory here though does show us, yeah, we're using single rank, and that's excellent. Single rank memory is a little bit quicker for gaming as opposed to dual rank. The good thing is as well is we're not overclocking this memory to get this sort of frequency. We're running 1.2 volts across all these different frequencies here, so 3200 is 1.2. This means that battery life shouldn't be affected by this overclock either, and that's good to see. Now that we know the RAM and the SSD are both working though, let's go over to the BIOS and I'll show you how to get this all set up. Getting into the BIOS on this unit is pretty easy. All you have to do is to turn it on and hold these two buttons down on the bottom. Give it a little while, but it should boot into BIOS directly. Now that we're in the BIOS, just make sure that you have a keyboard plugged in. The next thing that we need to do is to confirm the memory overclock. Go to the Advanced tab, scroll down to the AMD CBS, then go to the UMC Common Options, and then load up the DDR4 Common Options. The first option here is the one that we want, the DRAM timing configuration. It's going to say, yeah, this is an overclock. Are you sure you want to do it? This is where you got to be careful because you can cause issues with your unit if you set it too high. I know this memory is officially okay up to 3200 megahertz, so that's what I'm going to set mine to. Once you're okay with it, just go ahead and click accept. Make sure to enable the overclock at the top and all these options should come up. The first option here, the memory clock speed, is the memory frequency. You'll notice that this is half the rate of the memory advertised. That's because DDR is double data rate, so this is effectively doubled in Windows. To set this to 3200 megahertz, well, you just got to set it to 1600 megahertz. As mentioned earlier, the memory on the motherboard is 3200 megahertz, so you want memory in this unit if you're going to do an expansion on it that is 3200 megahertz so it matches. If it doesn't match, the memory is going to be out of sync, so you want to make sure to get that 3200 megahertz in there to get those extra few FPS. Everything else on this menu here though, leave to automatic. Don't touch anything here. Press escape, escape again. You can also load up the DRAM controller configuration, and this first option here is the command rate. I do recommend setting this to 1 as most memories should be able to handle that. This does get you a little bit better FPS in games, but for the most part, leaving it on automatic should just be fine. Since the memory in my unit is going to automatically set it to 1 anyways, with it on auto, I don't recommend changing this until you know what it's doing. I'm going to press escape, escape, escape again. All we have to do now is to change the VRAM. Setting the VRAM is pretty easy too. It's under that AMD CBS option. Then scroll down to this one here. We're looking for the graphics configuration, which is the top one. You have to make sure to set this integrated graphics controller to forced, the UMA mode. You want to make sure to set it to UMA specified. This lets us change it to whatever we want. If you have an 8 gig model, I do recommend only setting this to 1 gig. If you have over 8 gigs of RAM in your unit, I would recommend setting it to 2. Anything more than 2 gigabytes is not really recommended on this unit, as anything more is kind of wasted. The APU in this device here isn't going to be able to take full advantage of using 3 gigs of VRAM and up, so 2 gigs or 1 gig are the only options that I would recommend. I'm going to go with 2 since I have 12 gigs of RAM in my unit. Using 2 in this unit should give me 10 gigs available memory for Windows, which is more than enough. Once that's been set, all you have to do is escape, then go to the far right and save changes and exit. Go ahead and save those changes. We've got Windows loaded up now. Let's check the VRAM to make sure that that's showing correctly. Under the graphics tab on CPU-Z, you can see, yeah, we got 2 gigs of VRAM, and the memory for the GPU is set to 3200 megahertz. This should help immensely with gaming, and as mentioned, you should be getting anywhere from 10 to 20% FPS increase. Unfortunately, I didn't record any benchmarks before, but memory is also single rank, so that's pretty good, as that is going to be a lot better for gaming than dual rank. And the clocks are in sync now too, which is nice. Overall, this was a really nice upgrade and it fixes a lot of issues. We've given ourselves a nice SSD, so everything's going to load a lot quicker. We've also given ourselves some extra memory and some extra VRAM. I'm interested to see what kind of games I can play on here now, so I'm going to give it a couple more tests and see where it sits. Have you guys upgraded the storage in your unit yet? What do you think about it? Do you think you'll upgrade the RAM too? Let me know in the comments below. I was going to take some performance measurements on this device after these tweaks, but unfortunately, even though I'm setting it to 20 watts, it's only getting upwards of 16 watts total. Most of the time, however, even when setting it to 20 watts, I'm hovering around the 12 watt mark. It'll occasionally jump up to 14 or 15, but it's definitely not keeping that TDP that I've selected in the Loki Control Center. I do know that AOIN is aware of this issue though, and they're going to be working on a fix soon hopefully. However, in the meantime, it's pretty hard to take performance measurements when I can't use the entire processor. However, one thing I'm noticing for sure is because of the memory we fixed, we're now getting a lot more consistent frame times and frame rates as well. Even though I'm limited to 16 watts and under, this is still helping immensely on a lot of games. Even on Persona here, yeah, the VRAM is definitely going over 1 gigabyte. I've never seen it hit 2, and it's probably come up to about 1.4 max, but the increase to VRAM is helping this game. Most likely though, we're still GPU limited. As you can see at the top here, it's definitely reaching 100%. In this case though, that's usually the factor in why we're not getting better frame rates. But the VRAM is a welcome improvement, and going over 1 gigabyte to 2 gigs is definitely helping. The memory tweaks are also helping the frame time here, and we're getting a lot more smoother frame rates. Zooming in a little bit while playing Sea of Stars shows a good picture of how the RAM has been fixed. If you look at the frame time in the top left corner, well, look how smooth that is. Occasionally before, you would see a little hiccup there and it wouldn't be very smooth. This would only happen every couple minutes though, and you wouldn't really notice it in gameplay, but now since the VRAM has been up to over 1 gig, we have it sitting at 2 gigs currently, and with that RAM fix, yeah, look how smooth that is. This is definitely making games more playable, and I can't recommend this mod enough. Even if we only added the same frequency memory to the Loki Zero here, I believe that it also would fix the issue as well. It's not a VRAM amount thing here. I believe we'd be fine with 1 gig of VRAM as well. It's getting that memory tuned correctly up to 3200 megahertz and keeping it in sync that's causing a lot of the issues. At least that's what I'm pretty sure that's going on here. Without further testing or another unit, I would have no way of noticing because unfortunately I've already upgraded my BIOS and I don't want to take it apart again. If you're noticing issues though on your Loki or any of the Loki devices in general, it could be something related to the memory. For now though, I'm still limited to 16 watt TDP, so hope they get a fix out for that soon. But as mentioned, they are aware of it, so I'm sure they'll get that fix out eventually. As for the most part though, I still love this console and I've been having a lot of fun with it. With these fixes in place, this makes this console way more enjoyable and I can easily recommend it still. Since this fixed a lot of the latency issues with the spikes in the frame time, I definitely recommend this mod. Even in my initial review on this unit, I didn't even notice those little latency spikes due to the memory until I looked closer into it. Someone in the community mentioned them, and when you start looking for issues, you start finding fixes. If that's been a problem for you, well, this is how you fix it. And it's a good way to make your unit look a little cooler with these joysticks. Overall, this was a really fun mod, and the unit is a lot better now that I've managed to fix all that. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.